Sure, let's do it. That way we have time for Q&A and all that stuff. Cool. You want to talk at the mic?
I'm really bad. I'm important that. Hi everyone, thank you for coming. We're going to get started and people come in. So I just wanted to introduce myself first. My name is Nidia Manuelos. I am an assistant professor in the Division of Continuing Studies, and I'm also part of the Center for the Research on College to Workforce Transitions, which is hosting this event. So before I introduce Dr. Huerta, I'm going to talk a little bit about the center and our mission and why I've been invited here. So the mission of the CCWT is to conduct and support research, critical policy analysis, and public dialogue on students' experiences with the transition from college to workforce in order to inform politics, programs, practices that promote academic and career success for all learners. So hopefully this will just be one of several series that we have coming out this year that address the transition for students from their lives to college and from college out into the workforce. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce Dr. Adrian H, who is an assistant professor of education in the Rossier School of Education at the University of Southern California. I almost said the wrong one. The University of Southern California. His research focuses on boys and young men of color, college access and equity, and gang-associated youth, with a focus on former gang-associated individuals who have gone on to earn post-secondary education degrees or credentials to understand what and who contributed to their success. He also helps education and social service personnel understand how to better support gang-associated individuals throughout the educational pipeline. Dr. Whitbeck is a past recipient of the American Educational Research Association Minority Dissertation Fellowship, and he earned his PhD in education at UCLA. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Whitbeck.
Okay. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for this invitation to be here. Thank you again, Matt, for this opportunity. So today I'm going to be sharing some of my work on examining the post-secondary education pathways and successes for former gang members, a qualitative focus. I also want to share recently, I was awarded the National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation Postdoctoral Fellowship. Thanks. So I'm going to with these funds, I'll continue this work and interview more former gang members who have gone on to post-secondary education. So a little bit more about myself and my content expertise. I've published a number of papers focused on gang-associated or system-impacted populations. Most recently had a chapter accepted to the Oxford Handbook of Gangs in Society, looking at education and criminology so we can understand how does the school to prison pipeline contribute to gang involvement and their impact and their pathways throughout K through 12, which is something weird to say is I'm a leading expert on gang youth and educational pathways, which is something I'm still trying to absorb to say. Last year, or a few years ago, I was also a consultant with the National Gang Center, which is a research and training arm of the Office of Juvenile Justice Prevention, something. They got a lot of money from the federal government to do prevention work. So how did I get to this work and why am I doing it? So there's a lot of scholars that look at boys and men of color, gang involvement, and school to prison pipeline. And they've done a tremendous amount of work to figure out why do youth join gangs and what are their experiences in schools and what's happening. And then there's another camp of scholars that looks at boys and men of color, college access and equity, and how teachers and educators treat boys of color throughout the school pipeline. What I'm doing with my work is merging both to understand what are the cross conversations that need to be happening, focusing on gang involved youth. Gang involvement is really important because across the US, there's over 1.1 million adolescents who are involved in gangs throughout the country. In California, we have over 50,000 youth from 7th to 11th grade that are gang associated. And the number's probably higher. In California, we have gangs in 57 out of 58 counties throughout California. So it's not just an urban issue, it's an everyone issue throughout California. So once an individual joins a gang, it's not because it's Tuesday, they're joining a gang because a number of factors that contribute to their gang involvement, fractures in their schools or homes or communities that lead, that contribute to that decision to finally join a gang and experience validation, to experience a sense of mattering, comfort, and a supporting community, because they're not getting it in their homes or in their schools for multiple reasons. We can spend an hour just talking about race and gender and zip code that contribute to gang involvement, but that's for another day. So why is this so important for education? Well, only 50% of gang-associated youth graduate from high school. And it's not because of academic ability, it's because once young people join gangs, we see immediate drops on their academics. Like I think they fall behind their peers, I think 3/4 of a year or half a year from versus their non-gang peers in that first year of involvement. And once educators perceive or suspect or confirm that a young person is involved in a gang, they start getting mistreated even more. And we compound that with race and gender and zip code, and it's really bad. So that's hence why we're only at 50% high school graduation. What's also troubling is that only 5% of gang members obtain a college degree. Again, it's not because of academic abilities, like the will is there, the interest is there. And in the work that I've previously done, gang associated youth are like, yes, absolutely, I want to get a college degree. Here are the careers that I would love to do. On a paper that I'm hoping to submit this month, these young people said, I want to become an architect. I want to become a probation officer. I want to become construction management person. I want to go into law enforcement. I want to do all these things. But when it comes down to school context, it contributes to them not getting any support from school personnel. School counselors and others would tell me, I'm not going to help that kid because that kid's bad. Like, I'm going to focus on this other kid. And we know throughout other like equity focused work in education is that teachers and schools are stretched beyond, right? There's only so much that they can do in their 6 hours, and schools are often triage for every community problem. So, but what's additionally troubling is that schools aren't trained or understand gang dynamics. They don't understand how long kids are in gangs. Most kids are in gangs for less than a year and a half, but educators, because of either TV or, primarily television, they believe that once a kid joins a gang, they're in that gang for the rest of their life and they can never leave. But again, kids are involved in gangs for about a year and a half or so, but they experience so many additional suspensions, expulsions, and they just get labeled and tracked in a way that just leads to their steady attrition from school. We know from the gang and dissonance research is that like college and education is a turning point. Like that is a critical turning point for people's lives. We in our country, we totally believe in second chances for the most part for some people, but education can be that turning point for gang involved folks. Other work from criminologists and sociologists have found that other turning points are like family, religion, jobs, having kids. And what's a challenge, or I would say a limitation of the previous work, is that we don't know how education works in the lives of former gang members to serve as that turning point. Like, what was that thing that led them to be like, I'm going to go to college today, or I'm going to stick with it. And that's what I'll be talking about today is how can we use a theory of possible selves, which is a psychological developmental theory, to understand the pathways and experiences through K through 12 and in higher education. So possible selves is like who they are and who they can become. Recently, this photo was from a series from a photographer, I think in New Mexico or in the Southwest, that took pictures of former gang members and used Photoshop to remove all their tattoos to show these folks what they could look like with change and investment. In California, we do have Homeboy Industries that does a lot of great work. A challenge of Homeboy Industries is that it's not everywhere. It's in LA, it's in downtown LA, and serves a very limited community. We don't have we don't have Homeboy Industries in Long Beach or Riverside or San Francisco or the San Fernando Valley. Although their impact could be amazing in those spaces, they're limited on what they can do geographically. So what is possible selves? So possible selves are the ideal selves that we would very much like to become. There's selves that we could become and the selves we're afraid of becoming. And that's really important for us to think about. And how they frame this work is looking at hoped for selves, expected selves, and feared selves. So I'm pretty sure y'all can make the associations between hoped for, expected, and feared. But what I'm focusing on today is on hope for, the hope for selves that these folks can become. So who are these people? So in my methods, once I got some funding from IRP to do this work, I did an online demographic sheet. I received interest from over, I think about 100 people from across the country. And then looking through that data, I was like, all right, who are the people that I want to talk to? So then I was able to conduct 2-part in-depth Zoom or telephone interviews with these folks. The interviews, each interview ranged from 75 minutes to 120 minutes. So in total, we're looking at like 80 to 100 pages of transcripts, sometimes more for these interviews. So it's taken a little bit of time to kind of get through all that, all those interviews. I was providing participants $50 per interview. Because of their status, most of these folks are still in vulnerable or compromised positions. So I wanted to be very thoughtful about compensating them. And although the interviews were conducted on Zoom, I didn't record them on Zoom. I recorded them on a tape recorder because to give people heightened privacy, because, you know, should Zoom get hacked one day, like I don't want all these conversations coming out. Something else that's important for me to stress is that I wasn't investigating their criminality of like, what gang acts did you do? What, you know, that wasn't the point of the interview. It was more like, when did you join the gang? What was what was happening in your home or in your community that led to your initial gang involvement? How long were you involved in the gang? Like, what were some of the things that made this a legit gang versus a non-legit gang? To try to like, for me to figure out, are these people like really sincere about their gang involvement? Or was it they just got together with a few people and they're like, we're a gang. And then like 2 weeks later, like, oh, we're not a gang anymore. Like, so some of these folks were involved in international gangs and voluntarily shared a lot of information that I was like, I didn't need to know that. So I paused, I strategically paused multiple times throughout these interviews because again, I didn't need to understand who they hurt, how they hurt people. Some folks that did, for the 37 people I interviewed, I'd probably say half were incarcerated at different times. So they felt comfortable talking about what were the things that led to their incarceration because they had already been tried and spent time in jail. Did field notes, third-party transcripts, you know, all that stuff. Something else I wanted to talk about is that this work was very intentional not to focus on damage-centered research, where I looked at like how broken people are, or like, let me do the Hollywood story of these folks. Like, it was like, no, I want to hear like about your life and in a real authentic way. So then that way I could figure out what schools and communities can do better. Something else that's really important to talk about is secondary trauma as a form of analysis, because listening to these conversations was also traumatic for me because there was transference, like hearing about people's parents walking out, hearing about drug addiction, siblings drug addictions, parents drug addictions, abuse in the households, domestic violence, either in different factors. You know, one person that I interviewed said like it brought him joy to bring other people pain. And just hearing that, I was like, I'm going to take a break from interviewing you. So we took a break, you know, like strategic breaks, you know, for my own self-preservation, because there was a lot to intake, all these pieces. And it also contributed to me even taking breaks from my family, where I was like, I'm just going to lay on the couch for like 2 hours. No one talk to me, because all these pieces were contributing to my own secondary trauma, trying to make sense of all these transcripts. So who are these folks? So we interviewed 13 women, 24 men. The average age was 42. So we're interviewing folks that were like 21, 22 to people that were in their late 60s. A majority of the participants were Latino or Latinx. What's really interesting is I want you to pay attention to the average age of gang initiation was middle school, freshman year, but then their gang departure was 24 and a half. So like I was talking to people that were deeply embedded in gangs for a long time versus the national average of 1.5 to 2 years. So these folks spent a lot of time involved in their gangs for multiple reasons, either economic reasons or that familial bond. Some folks even struggled with the conversation of what is former, because I still talk to my friends. I still have barbecues at my house. I'm still in conversation with them, but I'm not gangbang. One person that I interviewed shared that during his first year of grad school is when he decided to leave the gang, because one night him and his friends were doing stuff and it turned into a police chase, and the friends were like, "We need to protect you, we're getting out of your car." So it was like different moments like that where people really struggled with even the definition. And I've had people approach me at different conferences and they're like, I don't like the term former, that causes conflict. And I'm like, well, what am I supposed to call it? Right? Like there's even that tension in language. So how much education have these folks achieved? So strategically, I interviewed people that were on their path to the associates or bachelors. They've accomplished their associates, their bachelors, masters, and some folks that have their terminal degrees. And this was people that have PhDs in social sciences. Some of these folks are professors. One person I interviewed was in residency in medical school, or had completed medical school, was doing his residency at a research university. Some folks even emailed me and said, I would love to participate, but I'm a lawyer and I don't want to compromise my position should this get out. So what are some of my preliminary findings that I'm sharing today? But here, actually, let me jump back a little bit. So with less than 5% of folks, of gang members earning a college degree, like investigating their pathways and understanding how they got to the master's, a doctorate, or even to a BA is really important, because this counters the dominant narrative of what's happening in sociology and criminology, where they're like, these folks don't go. And I'm like, well, what's happening that led them to go and to finish? Because many of the participants I interviewed, they dropped out of high school and went back later in life to earn a GED and then go to community college. I think all but 2, maybe 3 of my participants started in community college. So it was a really interesting point of access, but it also took them years in community college to transfer. So some of these folks were in community college 4, 5, or 6 years for various reasons, either because of limited access to federal financial aid because of some of their previous convictions, or some folks didn't have, are undocumented or unauthorized in the US, so they don't have access to federal student aid. So a lot of things, or people were working full-time and going to school at night. So for a lot of these reasons, that's why it took them so long to finish. So today I'm going to be talking about their pre-college experiences, their external inspirations and motivations to go to college, the social and emotional challenges of becoming a collegian, and also gaining the academic confidence to become a collegian. So something else I did within the work that I haven't analyzed yet is I also have like social network analysis data that I hope to work on in the future. I don't know when I'll do that. I guess in my free time, I'll get started on that part too. So what are some of their pre-college experiences for these folks? So Jaime earned a master's degree in education, was gang active for more than 15 years. He talks about his experience when he decided to leave school in the 9th grade and didn't complete high school. He was one of the individuals that later went on to earn a GED, then enrolled in community college and was at community college for 5 years. His friends encouraged him to go to community college. They're like, there's something about you, you have it in you, you should do this. And he toyed with that idea for many years before he decided to enroll. And he left school at the age of 13. So he was being raised by his older sister and the sister's boyfriend. They didn't have food in the house. He talked about food insecurity on a regular basis. He talked about not having clothes on a regular basis, but it was a gang that provided him support and validation and resources to even just food. Because he was like, sometimes I'll look in my fridge and there was Taco Bell packets and that's all I had. And he talked about his experience with the administrative assistant who asked him for proof that he lived in that school district, because she suspected that he didn't live in that school district for whatever reason, and he forgot his bill. So what did she tell him? She's like, don't bother coming back because you're going to be dead or end up in jail anyways. And he felt a level of embarrassment that he's like, wow, like I let my family down. I let my mom down. I let all these people down. And, as you see, she said, stop wasting my time. And to tell that to a 13-year-old, like, I'm not sure where that is in the pedagogy or in the training for administrative assistants or school staff, but that's the moment that he left and he didn't go back to school for 10 years. So he just kind of hung out with his gang, got in fights, and just kind of survived for those 10 years. He later went on to earn his BA, then quickly enrolled in graduate school, earned a master's degree in education, and now works in a community college as a college counselor or an academic advisor type of thing, where he helps other system impacted folks transition into higher ed, but also like feels this big sense of duty to help people figure out their lives and to move forward. So what are some of the external inspirations to return to college? So for Daniel, who earned a medical degree and works at a research university, he was gang active for about 5 years. So he joined a gang around 11 or 12, was involved until about 17 when he became a father. As I mentioned earlier, like becoming a parent is one of the big things or one of the main factors that contributes to departing the gang. And that was his moment. He's like, he got married. He had a son, his first child. He was working at a diner, and he's like, I gotta, support myself. And then a few years later, an older couple came into the restaurant who like befriended him, and others would befriend him because they saw him there all the time. They're like, you're really smart. You should do something better with your life. And he's like, okay, like whatever. And then as you see, like someone said, it's like, I'll pay for your gas for you to do something with your life, because he was, in a compromised economic position, working at a diner. He's not making a lot of money. So the thought that someone was going to invest that money into him so he could commute the 1 hour to go to that for-profit institution, he made that decision. So he became an X-ray tech, and he did that for a number of years. So him being the only bilingual person in the clinic, he would translate for the doctors. So he was doing that on a regular basis, and then he could anticipate based on what the patients were telling him. He's like, okay, the doctor is going to say this and this. And then he was right. So after years of doing that, he's like, I could become a doctor too. So then he enrolled in community college at night, worked full-time, and was in community college for, I think, almost 4 years before earning his associates, and then transferred to a 4-year university, kept working at the clinic, had another child. And then he's like, okay. And then he graduated and he's like, all right, I'm ready. And then he quit his job to study for the MCAT, then got admitted. He got admitted to multiple medical schools across the country, but decided to pursue medical school where he did his undergraduate because of family proximity and his kids. And, that's where at that point, he said him and his wife bought a house, so he didn't want to leave. He went to medical school. So he was gang active, 5 or 6 years. But it was the investment of someone else to say, I can see something better in you. I can anticipate something better in you. You have it in you. Was that spark enough for him to say, yeah, I can do that? But there's also social and emotional challenges of becoming a collegian, because something I realized for a number of years, folks struggled with, am I smart enough? Because throughout their life, they're told they're an idiot. One participant said that his father called him a piece of shit, because he was drug addicted, he was homeless, like all these things that family lost faith. A number of family members and community members lost faith in these folks because they're like, you're never going to change. You're always going to be in a gang. You can't do anything with your life. So another gang member that earned a master's degree in education, and he was also gang active for about 15 years. He dealt with homelessness, drug addiction, disappointing his family. He was the one that shared, he's like, my father called me a piece of shit. He also went to the military, and he thought going to the military for 4 years or 6 years was going to give him the break that he needed from the gang. When he joined the military, one of his best friends from the gang joined the military, and they were gang banging in the military. So he wasn't able to really escape gang life. And he's like, oh, in the interview, he talked about how many gangs were in the military. And that's something that the military doesn't acknowledge, that there are gangs in the military, and then they receive additional training and this and that. It's one of those, I guess, like hidden secrets or like open secrets that the military has gangs. And let's see, and like he talked about the challenges of like doing therapy to manage all of his emotions for his past gang involvement for those 15 years, like the pain that he brought onto other people, the struggles that he dealt with in trying to transition from being, Tomas, the gang member, to this new person. Decker and other criminologists talk about like leaving a gang similar to battling drug addiction, because it's not just a clean break. You always get pulled back in for various reasons, or that teeter-tottering that like from gang activities, because they become a family. It's not easy to divorce your family because someone gets hurt, someone gets shot, there's a reason to always get pulled back in. And he dealt with that for a number of years. So as he shares, he's like, well, I did my 4 years in the armed services and the homies were still looking for me. Let's go do this, let's go do that. Not like super active, but he was very heavily invested. He was just trying to like, he went to community college to try to stay away from the hood, but the hood kept like persuading him to come back and get involved, to come around. So depending on his mood, sometimes he would go out and do stuff. Because he was on the younger side and he had a cleaner record, he was encouraged to do other things that weren't going to compromise, that wouldn't compromise older members that had longer criminal records. So there was always that tension of like, go do this and this because you're young and you have a clean record. So that led to a lot of illegal transactions over the years that he shared and unfortunately did time for as well. Oh, and now he earned his master's degree and now he's doing a lot of reentry work and helping other folks transition in. And he's deeply committed to that work and picks up individuals on their release dates, helps them move into transitional housing. He feels this big sense of obligation to help others because of all the benefits and resources that he's accumulated over his time now as a working professional. So there's also like a piece about gaining academic confidence, because just enrolling in college doesn't mean you're going to be an amazing student. There's a piece of it that like, how do you start forging that college identity? And what does that mean? And what does that look like? So I'm going to let y'all read this quote while I drink some water. So Joseph, his older brothers were gang involved. He lost his older brother and his nephew to gang involvement. He talked about growing up in a very abusive household with father was an alcoholic, would always beat his mom. And he talked about like how much pain that brought to him and to his older siblings, who then later got deeply involved in gangs. As I mentioned, he lost his older brother. So he talked about his gang involvement. He said that like, in elementary school, middle school, he was already carrying a gun for protection because he's like, I don't remember being a student. I just remember school wasn't a priority for me. It was about protecting myself and my neighborhood. Let's see. And he talked about losing many friends to gang involvement. So because of his gang involvement, it led him to going to youth camp. So he spent 5 or 6 years in youth camp where he earned his GED. He interacted with a lot of workshop consultants that would come in and try to do these workshops about leaving gangs and this and that. And he always told himself, he's like, I'm so much smarter than these folks. I know so much more than these folks. Like, why are they doing this work? So now he's a consultant, started his own nonprofit and does a lot of work with youth camps and trying to train folks to understand real gang involvement as a former insider. And he talked about once he earned his GED and got released, he worked at a number of places. He talked about working at JCPenney's and all these other places for a number of years. And although he had his GED, he re-enrolled in a local adult education and started doing his GED again, or taking those classes again, because he felt like he didn't have what it took to be a college student. And he was in those programs for about 1.5 years or 2 years when he said another homie approached him. He's like, man, why aren't you in community college already? Just go. I know someone, and introduced him, and he started taking classes, but he said he lacked direction. So he would take some classes, take off, take some classes, take off. And he said that once he started dating this young lady that took him on a walking tour of the college that she went to, he's like, I can be here too. So it was that moment that he realized, okay, I can do this too. like he felt like her family would talk down to him because he didn't have a college education. So he got more serious about community college and then, completed and enrolled in a 4-year university. And the 4-year university where he enrolled at had family housing. So he was in family housing with his young daughter. And he shares, like, in fact, I often share those I experienced more isolation and depression than in that college. And he completely felt out of place in the years that he was incarcerated. So when I was incarcerated, I was there with like-minded kindred spirits, folks with something in common. And once he got into higher ed, he didn't feel any connection to anyone because at that point of his enrollment, that was before like prison education programs or underground scholars or all these programs that help previously incarcerated folks transition, or justice impacted folks transition into higher ed. So he was often felt that disconnection because he had so much lived experience that being in classes with 18 or 20-year-olds, like it just didn't make sense. Like he felt like a big disconnection with other folks. So with the conclusion and implications, I think it's really important for us when we do this work on whether it's system impacted folks or justice impacted folks or former gang members, to really think about like, how do we humanize their stories and their pathways into education? Because collectively, like in education, we do a really good job of constructing and deciding who's college material and who is not. And we start making those decisions at 12, 13, 14 years old and can really change the trajectory of a lot of people. Even gang associated youth are saying, I want to go to college. We shut the doors to them at a very young age. So we wait for them to make a lot of fumbles in their lives before we determine that they're worthy of that investment. And it's not to take away from like rising scholars or underground scholars. Those are great interventions. It's just too bad that we don't do that when kids are 12, 13, or 14, when they really, really need that intervention or that investment to start creating a college going identity. And we also need to think about like, how do we support gang involved youth? Because we know what the data says. How do we provide like more like asset-based, like human-centric training when we were providing this to teachers? And when I was interacting in a previous study, when I was in a continuation school, teachers really mocked the diversity trainings and all those things. They said it was a waste of time. So there was really a lack of empathy. So it's like, how do we get the right folks in the spaces where students really need the most help because they've experienced like the most trauma and pain? Recently, I don't think I shared this part, but like I received a grant from the US Department of Education for $1 million to help create college pathways for gang associated youth. And over the summer, working with with Long Beach City College, we're creating this program. And like, we're trying to figure out how can more community colleges do similar programs. So this summer we had 25 former gang members and gang impacted young people in this program to try to figure out how do we create stable college pathways for them. So something we did with that program, as we're only in year one of a 3-year grant, but something that we intentional in the design was like, how do we provide students access to social workers? How do we provide students access to workforce development? And those are the pieces that we built into the grant. Is we couldn't afford a full-time social worker, so we hired a graduate student who is doing social work. So we have a social work intern to lead trauma-informed sessions for a lot of these folks who have experienced a lot of life. Now, one of the young people that's in that program, when he started sharing his story, I was like, wow, like that person really needs access to the social worker, but with also more interventions. And the project director tells me he's the most actively involved student. He's like in his office every day, emailing questions, trying to get access to all the resources so he can complete his degree or his certificate in welding and get a job. He's really, really motivated to that. And last point I want to share is we as educators or social scientists, we kind of need to move from like feared or expected selves that we place on students to like, how do we think about more hope for selves for young people? Because I think we do a really good job of shutting the door for students who don't meet the social norms of schools. So how do we really rethink our practices to better embed and support these young people so they can do something different with their lives? So with that, thank you so much. Appreciate your time. And we have about 20 minutes for questions, if any. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for being here. My name is Huerta, your PhD candidate here at the School of Education. I love your talk, especially with the qualitative nature of the research that you're doing. And I have a question. So you may have, I know you're on Twitter. I'm following you.
Thank you.
Something that was controversial, I think, partially this spring, was that there were people who were wearing their regalia once they got their PhDs, and they were throwing up gang signs
Oh, wow.
in their photos. So I know this because I'm from Chicago, where gangster disciples are a big group, and so there were women and men who were regalia, like throwing up PhDs, and it caused. Well, a lot of people had a lot of things to say, so I'll just put that there. But I'm just curious with your research. It sounds like what you were saying is that these men and women often had to leave, or they kind of struggle with leaving, and then going to education as if it were like gang or education. And I'm curious if in your data, if there were ways in which you saw that they continued, right? Either with gang affiliation and continuing with education, trying to see that. Or alternatively, like what ways did gang affiliation actually help them? In what ways was it positive to them continue their education? There's skills, there's there's a lot learned. So anyway, I'll just put that out there and you can answer it.
If I could start on the second part,
Yeah.
that was actually a part of my interview protocol, was like, what are things that you learned on the street that helped you better navigate these spaces? So I haven't done a deep dive into that data yet, but that's a part of my data set, was trying to figure out, like, you know, you learn so much, like, how are these skills transferable? And then the first part was about, like, a lot of the folks that I interviewed, like some of them strategically moved, just say hypothetically, they lived in Sacramento, they moved 2 hours north or 2 hours south because for them, like that was their easiest break, because they did so much stuff in that community. They felt like they were always going to be targeted either by the police or rival gang members, even because of their OG status. Like one person I interviewed that is also a PhD candidate and was gang involved for like 10 years and started actually a notorious gang in his community. He was one of the founding members. He still struggles with the guilt of what he created in that space. And he talked about like the racial segregation, the racism in that space, that was our only outlet, was to create our crew and our community. But now he deals with the guilt of that. And now he's trying to do a lot more community-based work to make amends. But there were a number of folks that were still, like I mentioned, that individual that still has barbecues up to this day with his friends, but now he doesn't live, just say hypothetically, in like the big city anymore, but lives in the suburbs, like hours away. But like his friends from that gang still drive out to the suburbs, and one of his friends that is a gang member is a godfather to his son. Like they're still deeply connected, but just he's not on the street, he's not on the corner anymore. Like I interviewed a person that was in a wheelchair that got paralyzed because of his gang involvement. And he's like, I was still on the corner. He was at that point where he was talking about graduate school, but he was still on the corner until the doctor told him, like, if you don't stop doing what you're doing, like you're going to die. So like, that's when at the point he's like, okay, I think I'll take a break from gang involvement, because he gave everything. He gave his body to gang involvement, but like, you know, he still was pulled in different ways. You know, I can't remember specifically if it was like his family, but it was like family members, but he was deeply entrenched and couldn't break away. So that's still, for a number of the folks, like it was not just like a transitional identity, it was a deep part of their identity that they still can't break away. And there's times that folks that I interviewed were like, I don't want to let my gangster out. Or like, you know, I don't drink alcohol because if I start drinking, I'll start gangbanging, right? Because there's extra layers of addiction and violence and things that like people are still struggling with, that I wish I was an addiction scholar to really understand, like, what are the pressure points that lead people to do different things. But thank you, that was a good question. Okay, anyone online have a question? Oh yes, please.
So thank you so much for your talk, and again, I also really appreciate the qualitative nature of what you do. When you tell the stories that you're telling about as possible. So one of the things I notice, and I like find this information in my own policy work, is that I tend to pick out specific moments that people say impacted them. And I'm wondering if that's representative of how you think about this process, that there are sort of key transitional moments in which things shift, or if that's just a byproduct of how, we end up talking about things. Your sense in the interviews, is it more of a sort of evolution, or does it seem like there are this person gave me gas money, now I switch my academic identity to be a cost? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I want to say I included a question too about like, what was that moment that like the light bulb turned on that you said, I'm done with this. And some people talked about betrayal in the gangs. They talked about just like tired of, like living on people's couches. It was like a buildup that finally, it was that point of like, okay, I'm like, how much more of myself do I have to give into this life? Like one person I interviewed was, dropped out of a school at 12, or another person dropped out of school at 12 or 13, another youth camp, grand theft auto, all this stuff. And I think he was 23, 24 when he was like, I'm done. He was like, how much more do I have to give of myself in this gang? Like before, like I can focus on myself. Because like, even though he gave like 10 or 11 years of his life into this gang, he was still expected to pay dues into the gang. So then once he was released from state prison, he was like, I'm done, like no more. Like how much more, like I spent 8 years of my life incarcerated as an adolescent, as an adult, like how much more do I have to prove that I'm committed to my gang? So it was just like for different folks, those different reasons that led up to that moment of like, okay, I'm breaking away. Like I can't give any more of myself, but like from that person that I mentioned that was paralyzed to this last person that, like is enrolled in community college and just trying to transition out, like how much more of themselves can they give, right? Like, I think that tipping point is like, everyone comes at it at different points. So like one person I interviewed that was in his 60s, like talked about, being addicted to heroin because of his gang, right? And he's like, he dropped out of like a super prestigious university to help the gang do stuff related to drugs. So he's like, no more, right? So like he attended community college, earned his associates, and he started doing stuff. And then there was a shift in the gang culture to focus more on drugs. And then he got deeply embedded in that, and was addicted, was homeless, was incarcerated, and then like went back and like had a kid or two and was like, okay, like how much more? And I think he was still once he finally stepped away, he was already in his 40s and he gave 20 years of his life, if not more. So, so for different folks, it's different pressure points that lead to that decision to like, I'm breaking apart, or I'm breaking away from gang life. And I also asked, like, one of the questions was like, did you have to ask permission to leave from your gang? Like, what was that process? And many of the folks talked about, I already paid my dues, or I just moved away, or I had a kid, or, like there was also different gender dynamics too at play. So my research assistant conducted many of the interviews with the women, because I was like, there's probably stuff going on there that they want to share. And she had mentioned like a number of like participants talking about like sexual violence and all this other stuff that I don't feel that they would have shared with me. Yes.
Professor, I really appreciate you coming and sharing your insights with us, and I'm really excited by the conversation. My name is Peter Moreno, and I direct a program here at the university that delivers.
I looked you up.
Well, I did. So we're starting to teach UW-Madison classes to students in prison now. It's a relatively new program. And as we're seeing some of our students leave prison now and come out with this renewed sense of worth in the academic space and goals that they want to pursue academically, we're seeing them come to our campus. We're seeing them go to the Tech College campus, and they're encountering exactly these issues we talk about really not feeling like they have a sense of community. Like they thought for a while that they were a college student when they're in, but then they come on campus and they're not fitting in. So you talked about underground scholars, and I'm familiar with Project Rebound in Cal State as well. They're doing great work. We are at the ground level here at UW-Madison in building a sense of community for formerly incarcerated folks. And I'm just wondering, in your research and as you've looked into this question, are you seeing aspects of successful programs that welcome formerly incarcerated students on campus, and what does that look like?
Well, like most retention efforts are like, it's often student initiated because it's not the university pays attention to it. So like even at UC Berkeley, their program, I think Danny Murillo started it through just like seeing that there was a gap, right? So like often, but now in California, like a number of community colleges are creating Project Rebound style programs. And I think what works is just creating that space for those students. And one of the participants that I interviewed, well, a number of the participants I interviewed were connected to reentry type of programs in higher education settings. And I think because they have that awareness, that sensitivity, and also that lived experience, it gives them more of a platform to be able to talk about like, this is what I went through. Here's the things I dealt with, whether it was addiction, incarceration, gang involvement, all these pieces, I think really leads to that. So one program that's really good is there's a program at Mount Sac Community College that does a really good job. And I also know Cal State LA does a really good job at their Project Rebound style program. Who else is doing a really, I actually wrote a book chapter for the Handbook of Higher Ed that talks about some of the challenges and limitations of these programs or prison education programs because of structurally, like they create more barriers for students that are incarcerated than need to be, but that's an ongoing conversation across the country. And during lunch, we could definitely talk more about it. All right. I probably didn't answer your question, but in California, they have a lot of programs throughout the community college, 4 years, the Cal States and the UCs. And it's really just helping students figure out how to better navigate that space. Joe Louis Hernandez, I did a special issue on carcerality and education for American behavioral scientists. And Joe Louis Hernandez wrote a really good paper about how formerly incarcerated folks create their own support networks to understand how to better navigate the institutions, because they understand and they're able to like figure out where are the resources in an institution to figure out how to like empower each other to get through. All right, I think I have time for one. Oh no, I have time for like 2 more questions. Anyone online? Yes.
Yeah, no one online.
Oh, okay.
They're very quiet. So. But I had a question into this really good question about like these moments, these transitional moments, because we see this a lot in qualitative research and education, that it's like someone told me I was college material, or someone saw more in me than I saw myself. But I always wonder, there are probably lots of really smart students who are not having people say those things to them for some reason, right? So I wonder if you noticed any patterns in who was being told, like, even though you're working at Denny's, I can still see that you should be somewhere else. Is it like proficiency with the language? Is it like how they are communicating? Is there something about them that's indicating, or that's like kind of indicating intelligence? Even if, there are lots of other students who are not doing that, who are also still intelligent. I would do great in college. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, totally makes sense. Like and that's, I think one of the challenges is like, how do you like create like a policy recommendation, like on divine intervention, right? Like it was just this moment where someone showed up to, and it's like, well, how do you create a policy or practice related to that? And it's like really hard, because I was asking folks, like, what was that moment for you? And people would share like these very critical moments or something that stood out to them from different points of their lives. And it was often just by chance that someone bumped into them or said something to them, or dinner conversation, whatever. And that's the hardest part. But I think in the social network analysis piece that I can do is like, who was that motivation for you? Like to go to higher ed, like I could probably quantify whether it was a family member, whether it was a nonprofit, whether it was, a teacher or a counselor, whatever it was, but it was often not in K through 12, because that's where they got pushed out like over and over and over again. Like one participant, the one that is a PhD candidate in social sciences, recalls a moment where a high-level school administrator told him that he was a menace to the learning environment, right? And it's like, you remember that moment, and like the guy's in his 50s and still remembers when he was 16 and someone told him that, right? So it's like, we can remember all the bad parts, but now I'm trying to focus on like those positive moments, and that'll probably be in a future paper. But thank you, that's a really important question to think about. Yes.
You have what seems to be very rich data, and you made a lot of what seems to be very clever and thoughtful decisions methodologically to get those data. I'm wondering if you could share if there are one or two things that, like, for other researchers, this is something that works great for me to get great data. You might enjoy this.
It was really hard to be quiet. Like during the conversations, like really just like listening to folks and not interrupting folks, because like I took pages and pages of notes during each of these interviews. There was also like this like big emotional burden that I talked about too, that like weighed heavy on me, that like kind of like impacted my clarity, because like they would say, oh, I got shot at, it wasn't a big deal, blah, blah, blah. And this person got hurt and da, da, da. And I'm like, what? Like, right. Like I'm focused on that and they've already moved on. Right. So it's like hard to like calibrate in that moment. But I think because as a qualitative work, like as a qualitative researcher, it's like, you got to be locked in, but sometimes it's really hard to be locked in when people are sharing so much stuff that you're like, what part of that sentence do I unpack first? Right. And I think just taking like a lot of notes really helped me be able to come back. I did 2-part interviews, and with some of the folks, I had to like come back a third time and be like, hey, you shared these things. Can you clarify these things for me? That was the hardest part, but also the most painful part, because then like trying to think about their well-being and not having them re-experience that trauma. So it's like, trying to find the right balance in preserving the participants' well-being, but then also try and get the data. So I think that's one of the hardest parts of this work. Thank you. Here, let me get the guy in the blue, and then we'll go online.
Great presentation. Really appreciate it. My name is Jesus Basta. I'm a first year here at School of Education counseling staff, and I just wanted to ask. I have 2 questions. One, was there some sort of reasoning as to why you chose former game members instead of active game?
IRB. IRB didn't even. It was a battle with IRB at my institution, because the woman told me specifically, there's no such thing as former gang members. They're involved their whole lives.
Is there any sort of like work being done to try to see if we can open up some sort of a field study with IRB?
Post tenure, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Next one.
Yeah.
Was in the beginning you talked about there's like these different pods of people, right? Like counselors, social workers, educators, and trying to find in what ways like this discussion is being had, like meeting the common ground. What, I guess, for counseling psych is like, was there any sort of evidence or like some during these interviews that they kind of share, like, hey, in this like counseling session that I had, this language allowed me to see myself in like this hope for there's like a framework that was being like kind of thought on, or some sort of like effective practice that was seemed to be very helpful.
For the folks that did disclose like seeking like therapy or mental health, like like mental well-being, I would say it was only a handful, maybe 5 or 6 people talked about going to therapy to like try to like rid their demons of like all the stuff, like like I mentioned, that person that said he enjoyed bringing people pain, like it made him happy. But other folks like like Tomas and Jaime, they talked about actively seeking therapy to like try to like be in a good place, because now many of these folks are parents, so they're trying to like rework or like trying to process like and stop intergenerational trauma. So like within themselves, like they have that awareness because of their own education training of like, oh wow, this is what trauma looks like, right? So they're trying to rework their own stuff and deprogram themselves, but they're trying to deprogram like households experiences of like various levels of abuse, their own involvement in gang violence. There's a lot to unpack, but I didn't inquire into like, so what, are they doing CBT or like, what are they, like I wasn't asking them the type of therapy that they were seeking or receiving just because that felt like a little too intrusive and like outside of the scope of my interview. But good question though. Thank you. All right. I see online. If you could talk about a bit more about the demographics and how you selected participants. Did participants' immigration status play a role? I did not ask like a citizenship question, like that just felt like out of scope. If people shared, they were undocumented at one point or another, like that wasn't a part of my my interview protocol. My decision to interview the folks that I did was, and I'll share. So I try to find a balance between people at different levels of education, right? So some people that were the pathway and experiences of going up for your associates is very different than going for your doctorate, right? So I was trying to be very intentional about like, what were your experiences here? What led, how did you decide to go from your BA to your master's or your BA to your doctorate? Like, what was that process like? Because people had different life trajectories. Like some people were incarcerated, some people were not, like, even getting access to a mentor to even build them up that they could go for a doctorate was a very different conversation than someone going for a certificate. So like each of those pieces, that was a very intentional design by me to figure out, I need to interview people at these different stages so I can talk to, when I start writing papers from this data and I'm talking to community college administrators, how to think about this population versus someone going for a doctorate or a master's degree. How do we talk to graduate advisors about supporting this population, right? Or what do graduate schools need to do or think differently with people with this profile, right? So those are some of the pieces that came into play for me, for that person that asked that question online. All right. I think no, I'm done. All right. Thank you. Appreciate it.
One last announcement, if you're a grad student, or you have friends who are grad students, and you want to have breakfast with Dr. Westbrook tomorrow, we're going to be here in room 198 at 10 a.m. and just have coffee and bagels and stuff and say hi. Well, I was thinking that would be nice, just so I know how many bagels. Okay, but that's okay. You can stop. That's all right. Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. No, it's